the Canon FX. Well, here it is, folks. My first ever film camera. At least my first ever working one. This camera was first released by Canon in 1964. And 1964, what a year. The Beatles released A Hard Day's Night, the Dave Brubeck Quartet made Time Changes, and Elvis Presley starred in the absolutely monumental and groundbreaking movie, Kissin' Cousins. More importantly though, the Summer Olympics in Tokyo were also held this year, and this is the real monumental event because it was the very first time the Olympics were ever held in Asia. And this time period in general was more or less when Japan began to be seen as a peaceful manufacturing powerhouse. Its economy was rapidly rising, and the Tokyo Olympics were above all a celebration of that. So I suppose in preparation for this event, Canon released the FX in April of 1964, 6 months before the Olympics in October. Now, I'm sure I sounded so pretentious there, but anyway, that's a quick history of my camera. It's the very first model to have Canon's FL lens mount, and apparently it's a pretty special mount, but I can't seem to figure out why. Anyway, the lens that came with my FX is just a standard 50mm f1.8 lens, which can focus from 0.6 meters or about 2 feet all the way up to infinity. It's pretty easy to use this mount. Like many Canon mounts, all you have to do is align the red dots and then twist. So now, let's get into the camera itself. Taking a look at the top first, you can see the camera's rewind crank on the left. There's also a built-in light meter, which from this little window can measure from EVs or exposure values 1 to 10 on the low light setting and 9 to 18 on the high light setting. You can see how as I change my shutter and film speed, the numbers on the light meter also change. You can also turn it off or check how much battery power is left with this little wheel. Unfortunately, when I got this camera, the battery compartment was already pretty corroded, so I don't think I can fix that. And you know, I can't even turn any of these. Anyway, in the center, you'll find the viewfinder, which I'll discuss in more detail in the next segment. Now on the right, you can see the shutter speed selector, film speed selector, shutter button, and film advance lever. This camera can make exposures as quick as 1/1000th of a second to as slow as 1 second, along with a bulb mode if you need to take even longer exposures. It's pretty easy to make long exposures with this camera because the shutter button can be threaded with a standard cable release. There's also an X shutter mode, which you have to use with electronic flashes. You can connect a flash to the front of the camera here. Now you can set the film speed to pretty much anywhere from 10 to 800 ASA, which nowadays we call ISO or ISO, and you can find its corresponding DIN value beside it. Now around the shutter button, there is this little wheel which you can turn to the A or the L position. A means that the shutter button can shoot, while L means it's disabled or locked. Unfortunately, similar to the battery compartment in the light meter, I can't turn this either on my particular camera. Above the film advance lever, you'll also find a film counter which goes from S or start to exposure number 40, and it resets every time you open the back cover. On the front of the camera, you'll find a timer, which you can use for group shots, and a lever which brings the viewfinder mirror up for quieter shooting. although it's still quite loud since it doesn't have a leaf shutter. Here, have a listen. Now moving on to the bottom of the camera, you can see a standard tripod mount, the rewind release button, and this thing, which you move and then twist to open the back cover. Speaking of the back cover, once you've opened it, you can see that the inside of the camera is pretty simple, pretty standard, and as you can see with this roll of HP5, which I'm literally gonna be shooting right after recording this, you load the film from left to right, and you have to make sure that the film aligns with the sprockets and shutter curtain. Then afterwards, you're gonna close the door and begin shooting. When shooting film in this camera, everything is completely manual, so you always have to remember the photography triangle of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO or ISO. There are much better guides than that elsewhere, and I'll drop some video links in the description if you want to learn more about that. But anyway, in the end, all of that is pretty easy to understand, so don't worry so much about it. Now, remember that here in the center you'll find the viewfinder. If you look inside it, you'll see exactly what your lens sees, and you'll also see a circle in the middle that's cut into two halves. Adjust the focusing ring on the lens until the two halves align, and then your shot is properly focused. You can change your aperture to control your depth of field by turning these two rings here on the front of the lens, and once again, you can change your shutter speed at the top of the camera. Once you're ready, you can press the shutter button and take your photo. Afterward, make sure to turn the film advance lever to the next frame. This camera doesn't let you use the shutter button more than once per frame, so you can't do double exposures very easily. Also, you can't advance without taking at least one shot in the frame you're currently on, so you don't have to worry about skipping frames. Now when you finish shooting, all you have to do is rewind the film by pressing the rewind release button once, and then turning the rewind crank until you hear a snap, which is the sound of the film getting out of the take-up spool inside the camera. After that, you can open the back cover and process your film. Now, there are three main pros and cons which I'd like to enumerate for this particular camera. So first, the pros. Number one, it's built like a tank. This body contains a lot of metal, so it's very tough, and I'm sure it can withstand quite a lot of damage. Number two, it has pretty much everything a beginner needs. It has a wide array of settings for aperture and shutter speed, as well as a light meter, which is great for beginners. If only mine worked. And number three, it's pretty much fully mechanical. The only thing that needs batteries in the camera is the light meter, and you don't even need it to shoot. So pretty much, you can keep on shooting even if you have no batteries. And this is much better than something which is fully electronic, because there are no parts like resistors or capacitors which may go bad and which you have to replace later on. So it's much easier to repair and maintain. Now for the cons. Number one, it's very heavy. And I know I said earlier that its superior build quality is a pro, but to some, the weight of this camera can be a pretty big con. So just keep that in mind. Number two, it's fully manual. Again, this can be a pro to some, but I know that others may have some difficulty adjusting to this camera's controls. The Canon FX has no autofocus, no aperture priority, no shutter priority, or any other automatic function. And lastly, for number three, the light meter uses outdated batteries. The Canon FX's light meter uses 1.35 volt Mercury PX635 batteries, and since these are made of mercury, they were essentially banned later on. However, you can still find replacements somewhere, but they're not going to be as accessible as, for example, AA or AAA batteries. So that's definitely one thing to consider. Now, here are some shots from this camera. I'm sure you've already seen most of these in last week's video, but that's just because unfortunately I haven't developed my other rolls yet, so I currently don't have any new photos from this particular camera. By the way, like many old film cameras, this particular FX has a pretty inaccurate shutter speed once you get to the slower speeds due to its age. And so I always shoot at faster speeds, and the slowest I've ever shot with this camera is at 1 125th of a second. Anyway, that's about it for this video, so thank you so much for watching, and once again, this is Film Month on the channel, so if you want to see more of this kind of content, be sure to support me by liking the video, subscribing, all of that YouTube algorithm stuff. And well, that's about it from me, so I hope all of you are having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye!